for the Home School Book Talk for Here, Right Matters, an American Story. And we have with us the author, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who was most recently Director for European Affairs at the White House's National Security Council. Prior to retiring from the U.S. Army, he served as a foreign affairs officer with assignments at the U.S. embassies in Kiev, Ukraine, and Moscow, Russia, and for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a political military affairs officer. He's currently a doctoral student here at SAIS and also a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute, which I direct. He's also a Pritzker Military Fellow at the Lawfare Institute, a board member of Renew Democracy Initiative nonprofit, and also a visiting fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry World House. But we definitely count you as one of our own, Alex. Moderating the session is our Dean, Kent Calder, who is the interim dean and also director of the Edwin O. Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies. Prior to SAIS, Calder served as a special advisor to the U.S. ambassador in Japan, Japan chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, professor at Princeton University, lecturer on government at Harvard, and is the first executive director of Harvard University's program on U.S.-Japan relations. A specialist in East Asian political economy, Calder lived and researched in Japan for 11 years and across East Asia for 4 years. Calder's recent publications include Global Political Cities, Actors and Arenas of Influence in International Affairs, and Supercontinent, The Logic of Eurasian Integration. So with this background, I am pleased to turn the floor over to you, Dean Calder, for what promises to be a very interesting discussion.
Thank you very much, Cinnamon. It's a real pleasure, I must say, tremendous pleasure to have you with us, Alexander, here at SAIS. And, you know, we're delighted that you're a member of our SAIS community. And in that connection, I must say, it's a special pleasure to be here as your book, Here Right Matters, is being launched. I must say, I was reading that. I've been reading that, of course, for the last several days, and listened in just a bit in a discussion that you had previously. And it really is striking. Of course, since you are at SAIS now, I wonder if you could tell us here at SAIS how it is that you decided to come here and to write this book, and if there's one or two lessons that you can share with us from that.
Sure. First, let me thank Cinnamon, Dean Calder, Ginny, and SAIS for the warm welcome. I'm super excited and happy to be able to speak here since I'm a student at the school. In some ways, probably a unique privilege, so I appreciate that. This was the only thing I had lined up. That's not a bad thing, but the only thing I had lined up when I left the military after 21 and a half years, I had connected with Elliot Cohn, the former dean, sometime before, and he, based on my reputation, some common friends and acquaintances, invited me to join this new program that had just started, the DIA program. And when he explained to me what exactly this was, it was a degree geared towards practitioners, folks that had already maybe a decade or more or a couple decades of service, and were prepared to do the work and write a dissertation or thesis on an advanced timeline. I jumped at the opportunity. I both needed a place to park myself. I welcomed the opportunity for additional professional education. It's kind of a strong theme in military service, professional military education, so it's something I've taken seriously. And I wanted to take a lot of that work that I'd done in a classified environment, working on Russia strategy, operationalizing that strategy through the entirety of the military and see how much of that I could roll into the public discourse around our challenges with regards to the United States and regional and/or great powers. So I very, very much welcome that opportunity. With regards to the book, it's something that really came together quite quickly. Most of it was done with the intent of, right after I left the military, recognizing that there was a major commitment to academics in SACE. I think that was something that I pretty much had wrapped up by the beginning of November, and then I had to wait until the next administration took office to be able to get it through pre-publication review, which is always a challenge. This book is not necessarily simply about my experiences in the White House. It does definitely cover the Ukraine scandal and President Trump's corruption and abuse of power. But fundamentally, it's a book that explains the why and the how. Why I felt compelled to report presidential wrongdoing in spite of potential personal risks, and how I managed to navigate what was an unprecedented challenge. And reflecting back on the previous year or so, or more, I recognized that it wasn't limited to just my experiences, kind of like tactical maneuvering as events unfolded. It was the entirety of my life preceding that, an accumulation of tools from ethics and values passed on to me from my family, to military service, and all these different terms I throw in there about maintaining your situational awareness. I talk about not losing your bearings in this environment, the way you respond to kind of acute crises, being prepared to start over. I talk about my refugee family background, all these things, how they all were pivotal elements of my life that contributed to the how I try to do the right thing in the right way.
Well, we're delighted, of course, to have you with us, having been a bit involved in the creation of DIA, working with Elliot, of course, closely, and of course, in his extraordinary time as dean. It epitomizes, I think, your background, hopefully the things that you'll be doing here epitomize the way we see the DIA program would like to go. So we're delighted to have you with us. There are so many issues that I know our group here would like to discuss with you. But of course, a lot of this really begins with that riveting experience. I must have reread chapter 1 of your book 2 or 3 times. Some people here haven't yet read it. I wondered if you could describe for us what it was like listening to that critical phone call with President Zelensky, and then how that stimulated the chain of events that followed.
So I went into that phone call due to the preceding months of watching this corrupt enterprise effort to dig up dirt on then Vice President Biden in an effort to smear him going into the 2020 elections. I watched this unfold for months. And that morning, I went into that phone call with a mix of hope and optimism, which I tended to have. That's just kind of been part of my character, but also deep apprehension about how this could unfold. On the hope and optimism side, I had some opportunities to interact with President Zelensky and thought he was a funny, charismatic individual. He turned what could have been a pretty difficult conversation in the first interaction between Zelensky and Trump in April into kind of a pretty positive engagement. The second phone call was modeled on the first one in that they were both congratulatory phone calls. The first one was for Zelensky's victory in presidential elections, and then the second one was President Zelensky's brand new party that hadn't existed 60 days before won a landslide victory, an unprecedented victory in which they had majority control of the Rada, also unprecedented. And recognizing that President Trump likes winners and wants to be associated with those types of figures, there was some merit to scheduling the phone call. And my calculations were pretty straightforward. The Ukrainians asked for a phone call. This is what we do in normal situations. I could either, succumb to the potential risks, or be overly concerned about the risks, or try to do something on the merits. And that's why I proposed and attempted to schedule this phone call. Now, under normal circumstances, this would not be an issue. It's a straightforward congratulatory call. But National Security Advisor, Ambassador Bolton, declined to recommend the phone call, and basically the thing fell off the plate. And days later, well after typical congratulatory phone calls occur, it landed back on, and I learned later that it was Gordon Sondland, one of the president's political ambassadors and a big donor that had direct access to the president, and Mick Mulvaney, the chief of staff for the president, had coordinated this phone call, and it turned out that it was to close the deal on the Ukrainians agreeing to deliver this investigation into Joe Biden in return for a White House meeting and lifting the hold on security assistance. And maybe just to wrap up, what had been occurring in the months before this phone call, the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, had been smearing Ukraine as a corrupt state, that Ukraine was involved in 2016 election interference as opposed to Russia, and that the Ukrainians were unfriendly towards the Trump administration, and that while that was initially in the clear outside of official channels, private actors advocating this, slowly it started to creep into government officials and an impact directly on U.S. national security. That impact was the president's hold on security assistance that was announced, that I became aware of in late June, and spent the next couple of months trying to build consensus amongst the diplomatic community, the national security community, that this was harmful to U.S. national security. So all of these factors were swirling through my mind as the call convened around 9 a.m. on July 25th, 2019. And as soon as the president joined the line, I knew that this was not going to be a call that advanced U.S. national security interests. Just the president's tone, the way he was speaking, suggests that this was going to be a very, very difficult phone call. And that concern turned to something far more frightening when the president, in response to President Zelensky's request to purchase additional defensive weapons to fend off Russian aggression, the president responded with, "I'd like you to do us a favor, though." And I knew what my obligations were instantly.
You later, of course, there's a whole the chain of events that you discuss in the book. And of course, we know that many of those things, at least one version of them from media reports at the time. What was it like? You did closed hearing in the House of Representatives, as I recall, and you did an open hearing. What were those things like? How did they differ? What was it like to actually be the person who was going through all that sort of thing?
Well, as soon as the House committees, on September 11th, the House committees announced their investigation into the president's hold on security assistance, an illegal hold, frankly, because it violated the Impoundment Act. Congress had appropriated funds for Ukraine, and the executive branch, with little recourse to waive the allocation of that aid, had placed a hold on it. And as soon as that happened, the president reversed course because he was caught trying to apply pressure on Ukraine to get these investigations. I already started to suspect that I wasn't going to be able to stay kind of a private citizen anymore. And then by the time the House started to ramp up their inquiries into presidential wrongdoing, and President Trump, oftentimes his own worst enemy, released the transcript of the phone call, I was pretty sure eventually Congress would cast its eye towards me as a potential witness. I also recognized that I was the reporting official. I was the one that started the whole process rolling by reporting the president's abuse of power within official channels within the White House. And that eventually, as the director for Ukraine, the responsible officer, that I was going to be dragged into this public affair and all the consequential costs associated with that.
And so then, you testified, and of course, you noted the differences. To me, it was striking between the closed hearings and the open hearings. I guess that's sort of the dynamics among the politicians as opposed to, the broader public debate. Mm-hmm. Those two were rather different, it sounds like.
They were. I'm still not 100% certain that of my calculations. What I had considered is that behind closed doors, the Republicans that tend to be defenders of the military, proponents of U.S. national security, would in certain ways be a little bit more favorably disposed to a career military officer providing fact testimony to them. That turned out to not be the case, and I characterized that as those House members put their own personal ambition and their political careers above what their obligations were when they were sworn in as representatives. Not unprecedented. I mean, there haven't been too many of these types of investigations and impeachments, but I think that seems to be the case, that politicians will do that on a regular basis. But even behind closed doors, they consider themselves more defense attorneys for the president, whether that's looking at trying to poke holes in the fact testimony, which was impossible because the facts spoke for themselves. And I was probably about as well armed as I could be to articulate U.S. policy towards Ukraine and Russia, and they couldn't do that effectively, so they pivoted towards character assassinations, which again they weren't able to, as far as I'm concerned, they weren't able to do, but was enough to the administration was able to generate disinformation to try to impugn my character. And probably the most challenging aspect is that my hands were tied. I couldn't defend myself. I couldn't speak publicly. I was prohibited from really, being critical of various leaders by the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And I also, even if I didn't have that prohibition, I'd be drawn even deeper into a political fight, further hampering any possibilities of continuing in military service. But at the same time, I believed that my former seniors in uniform, the military, would at least kind of defend me as a honorable military officer, and attest to the fact that, unless I was exceptionally qualified, I wouldn't have even been at the NSC, and that didn't happen. So I was basically taking the slings and arrows, but without any way to defend myself. That was probably the most frustrating aspect of this. At the same time, that shouldn't detract from my prime. That in the big scheme of things was far less important than the role I had to play with regards to what I believe was my obligation to defend the Constitution and just provide, be a witness, even though the probabilities were that the Senate would acquit the president, even though this was going to harm my career. I wasn't going to be in a position where I looked out for my own self-interest and didn't do everything I possibly could to fulfill my duties. So that was the overriding calculation.
Well, and of course, this whole story, you'll see those who read the book in detail, and all of the complexity of those last days and months of your military career. Of course, you've had over the years a distinguished career of public service. I think 21 years, wasn't it, or in the military? Are you thinking of going back to public service in some way going forward?
Yeah, sure. Dean, wasn't part of the deal that it's mandatory reading for every student at Johns Hopkins to read my book? With regards to public service, I realized two things. First, I think there probably is another stint in government somewhere along the way, but it's not something that I've pursued or am really, frankly, actively considering. And if it doesn't happen, I'm probably okay with it. There are a couple of reasons. One, that I am really enjoying being accountable to myself and my doctoral thesis committee, and not really having to be subject to the calculations of other folks in government. And two, I've come to the conclusion that I could have a significant impact even out of government, out of uniform. I've been privileged to, over the course of the past year plus, actually, year and several months, to publish a dozen articles, maybe probably more than a dozen articles in leading publications.
The Post, I remember you had a historic one in the Washington Post.
Yeah. So a couple times in the Post, New York Times, a couple times Foreign Affairs, The Diplomat, a bunch of times in Lawfare. So pretty fortunate to, amongst my schoolwork, still get some articles out, and what I describe as infect the bloodstream of the policymaking community with my missives, which is a pretty awesome thing to be able to do. I realized also that I could fire off a 280-character tweet and generate news, and then have to follow up with a long, lengthy treatise in the Washington Post to defend my position. It's a pretty unique place to be. Talk to the American public about what I think would be important for U.S. national security. Be active and participate in elections. As much as I dislike the idea of being drawn into politics, I think the stakes are extremely high. I guess I kind of endorsed my first candidate, Terry McAuliffe, recently, and spoke on Jim Acosta. I think it was Sunday night or Sunday, to basically articulate my views in that regard. Because again, the stakes are high. I feel I know that this country is under threat from President Trump and Trumpism. And I have a voice to be able to participate in that kind of dialogue. I have an opportunity to advocate for public servants, which is pretty awesome because public servants don't have a voice while they're serving, and they tend to be the butt of jokes or target by one party mainly, sometimes the other, on inefficient, bloated government and things of that nature. There's no opportunity to advocate on their own behalf, so I get to do that. And I already described it, but when I'm active on the political front, it's mainly because I strongly believe in this idea of accountability, and that politicians must be accountable for their actions. So I advocate for ethics and values-based leadership, and if somebody falls short, I will make my voice heard. All of that is to say that I could still serve U.S. national security interests and public interests, even out of government. And if that's where I end up, I'm totally satisfied with that.
Well, I think you've just given us an eloquent definition of public service, something which goes far beyond a narrow government service alone, and is particularly effective when it has some appreciation of how actual policy works. That certainly, that sort of thing, together with the ethical dimension that you mentioned, are certainly aspects of the ways that we're thinking our educational process here needs to proceed. So thank you for that sort of broad exposition of the nature of, I think, public service. At the end of your book, maybe one last set of questions relating to that. You have in the epilogue 6 things that you mentioned. I'll just read them off, and any one of them, if you want to give us some concrete examples of what you were thinking of. Lessons from your experience. Start over and keep starting over. I guess you learned that first from your father's experience, if I recall. Commit to your passions. Navigation is everything. There are people here, and of course you talked about your family in particular in connection with that. Know your role. And then the last one, where, of course, that could be relevant both to a personal career but also, and maybe at the end you could take it to the area of foreign affairs as well, where I think you suggest it might be relevant to U.S. relations with Europe in some ways. But the maxim is, don't self-deter. And you go on, you talk about the little round top and the 20th Maine Regiment there. So what are your thoughts, especially on that subject of self-deterring?
Sure. So I think I guess I'll bookend with the first and last bullet. The thought on starting over and not starting over, to me, as I thought back on the decisions I made, I think they were both intertwined, frankly. I was not, and I'll turn it to geopolitics also, but I recognize that I was much, much better equipped than my father when he came here at the age of 47 with 3 young children and, $750 some odd dollars in his pocket. And limited language ability, and start over, and listening to him talk about his background and his family background, how multiple times my ancestors had to start over and keep starting over, whether that was him fleeing as the Nazis attacked into Kiev early on in the war, and his father dying, but also my mother's father dying in battle. And I was far, far better equipped as a career military officer with a very, very robust network of friends and supporters that I could call on, like Elliot Cohn or Ben Wittes at Lawfare, or my friends at the Renewed Democracy Initiative for advice, education, a proven kind of record, that I had the confidence that if I needed to, I could start over. And then that also ties into the fact that I didn't self-deter. I didn't let this idea of personal risk drive my calculus for the decisions I was going to make. With regards to geopolitics, I think I've experienced some of these this self-deterrence feature firsthand on multiple occasions. One episode that comes to mind was in November. I think it was November 25th, 2018, when Russian forces attacked Ukrainian naval forces in the Kerch Strait. What didn't absolutely need to be a presidential decision turned out to be a presidential decision in which the president suspended even normal military activities in the Black Sea because of a deep concern of how a conflict could escalate with regards to Russia. And that's because he frankly didn't realize that there were numerous safety valves in place, a deconfliction channel that had been running for several years at that point to avoid those types of issues. The fact that a deep understanding of, or even the ability to seek advice from experts that might be able to provide him sage counsel on how the Russians are likely to respond to that situation. They have zero interest in escalating a conflict with the US. On the conventional front, they would be on the losing side of that kind of conflict. Nobody wins in a nuclear exchange. So recognizing the fact that the Russians also would be keen to avoid a direct confrontation, there was no need to suspend all activities and basically undermine our support for Ukraine when they were facing a military aggression from Russia. I'd witnessed things of that nature multiple times, in previous administrations, when the Russians use kind of this doctrine of reflexive control, where they know exactly what signals to send to get the U.S. to self-deter, as they did with regards to the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass, when they staged nuclear alert exercises to convince us that there was a threat of escalation to a nuclear war if we provided robust support for Ukraine squarely in U.S. and Euro-Atlantic alliance interests. They do this habitually. They do the same thing with civil defense exercises to indicate that that there's an acute environment with regards to Russia getting ready for greater confrontation. Again, the fundamental calculation is that they don't win in that kind of exchange. No. The Russians are particularly effective at picking on vulnerable and weaker states, which Ukraine was in 2014, less so now, much more capable military, law enforcement arm that slowly, if you look at across the trajectory of the past 7+ years, almost 8 years, has made significant progress in developing functional institutions, state coherence, and so forth, and a military that at that point was somewhere a hollow 70,000 man military was now upwards of 200,000. Would put up a much more robust fight if the Russians chose to escalate the conflict in that region now. And we do the same thing with other adversaries because there are, in fact, practitioners, probably too few of them, whether foreign area officers or foreign service officers that spent a lot of time studying these issues, but we have both a lean and a highly hierarchical, rigid structure. So the subject matter experts are not necessarily the ones that are providing advice. That advice gets filtered through layers, and at each layer, increasingly senior leaders put their spin on it. Sometimes it's a good thing because they have kind of, they might be less deep in a topic, but they're broader and they understand the issues. But oftentimes the advice gets watered down, and it would be good to get subject matter experts to provide background on these issues when the president's making a decision. And I'll just quickly wrap up. And then we also don't have a workforce that's necessarily, it's reactive. we developed Russia experts after Russian aggression. And then that now with a pivot to more resolved pivot to Asia, that workforce may or may not have a home in the future. And now we're trying to grow a workforce that's geared on the China problem set.
Mm-hmm.
And we may or may not get there in time. So I think we tend to not be particularly strategic in perceiving the areas of investment early enough and making those investments, sustaining those investments for a long period of time.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that we're a little behind the curve perhaps in developing specialists in areas that are crucial to the future. Well, you've given us a lot to think about. My intuition is that we also have some reactions and some questions, perhaps first from the group that we have here, and then hopefully we'll also be able to take some questions from our broader audience as well. So the floor is open. Yes. Do we have microphones? Or I think what we can do, please. I can speak loudly, I think.
We can share.
I think we can share. So thank you, Cinnamon Dornseif, the Foreign Policy Institute. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Dean Calder, for leading this discussion to this point. I have two questions. One is substantive and regarding foreign policy, because you've talked a lot about the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. So what do you find are the main challenges in U.S.-Russia relations going forward? And then as a faculty member here at SAIS for 20 years, I know so many of our students are from immigrant backgrounds, as you are yourself. And you talk in the book about advantages of the immigrant experience and how that has helped your career. If you could share that with us and our students. Thank you.
So I think everyone heard, but the two key questions being U.S.-Russian relations, perhaps some broader assessment, and then the impact of the immigrant background, especially the positive elements in the way that has influenced your thinking.
Sure. So so I think I'll start with the immigrant background. I think that there are a couple things, one thing that I guess I have, and I came over as a very, very young guy, not quite 4 years old when we left. So no real lived memory or experience of Soviet Ukraine, but brought up in an environment where the history of my family in the region was something that I could learn about, almost on a daily basis. And that gave perspective, something that I think Americans don't necessarily, this is probably a light criticism, but it is a criticism that Americans sometimes forget that there are much, much more, bigger challenges than all the creature comforts. People don't enjoy democracy, don't get a say in their government, don't have freedom of speech. And I think that was my first taste of perspective, that coming from a family, modest means, and hearing about my family background, I understood the unique kind of excellence and exceptionalism of the United States. Through a career of 21 plus years, I served in all sorts of interesting postings, whether that was on the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, and seeing the stark contrast between the two, or in combat in Iraq, or in Ukraine, or in Russia. I recognized that we had something unique here, something that is definitely worth defending. So I guess I didn't, but at the same time, I think there were some countervailing forces in that I was so young. So I didn't feel it as acutely as maybe immigrants that have had that firsthand experience overseas. And maybe because of that, I had less complacency about where this country could be and the risks that this country faces, and less apathy to compel some sort of inaction when I thought either this country or my ethics or values were being challenged. And I think that that's part of the immigrant experience. I think immigrants have a kind of almost a unique understanding of this country. They made a choice to come here to the United States and participate in this great experiment. And there is not an easy way to share that with the public at large. I tried to do that by talking about the uniqueness of the U.S. and how, in fact, the risks that this country does befalls some democratic backsliding befalls this country are potentially real. I mean, we've seen that occur in less developed democracies. This one held strong under assault from a corrupt administration that slowly eroded various departments and agencies, but there was some harm done, and now there's probably one of our fundamental institutions, the one that I thought was most under threat when I made the report, which is elections, free and fair elections, has been under attack for over a year now, with the former president spreading the big lie and the fact that those 2020 elections were illegitimate, completely false statement and unfounded. So I think, perspective is pretty important. With regards to our relationship with Russia, my doctoral thesis is on the diplomatic history of U.S. foreign policy towards Ukraine since 1991 and looking at critical junctures. So I'm right now conducting a kind of rigorous academic research into that topic, but my bread and butter, my deep background is really on Russia and what our relationship has been with Russia, certainly over the past couple of decades, if not further back. My thought on the prospects for a healthy relationship with Russia is not optimistic. If I tend to be an optimist in general, I'm pretty pessimistic about what we are likely to accomplish with Russia. And the reason is, at this point, there's no trust between the various governments. So the ability we would have to start at the very foundational level of somehow rebuilding trust or verification regimes to engage with the Russians, because we can't believe what they're saying, whether that has to do with halting cyber attacks or interference in our elections or interference in our society. That's even more fundamental than the concerns we have about arms control and compliance with arms control. That's why the Trump administration withdrew from INF, because the line was logically hard to dispute that it's not a bilateral agreement if only one side is adhering to the INF procedure. So we have some very, very foundational work to do. It doesn't seem to me that Russia is the least bit interested in undertaking steps to improve the bilateral relationship. To me, it seems that whenever we engage in dialogue with the Russians, they see it as an opportunity to kind of bank some successes, maintain the status quo. And this suggests that there are very, very few areas that we could work with Russia. I know this administration, I wrote an article actually for the New York Times following the presidential summit between Vladimir Putin and President Biden. And I suggested that there's really not that much that we need to engage with the Russians on, because we can't trust them to be good partners. Under optimal circumstances, would it be essential to work with the Russians, the largest landmass anywhere on climate change? Yes, but they're going to again seek to constrain the U.S. or something, and not necessarily fulfill their own obligations. I think that's the same for within the arms control lane. And more than likely, unless there's significantly increased pressure on Russia to establish a deterrence regime, they're going to continue the same kinds of hybrid warfare approaches that they have over the past decade easily. And I think what we've seen is a erosion to that relationship based on Russia's aggression and malign influence because of the lack of response from the US and the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. If we in fact start to maybe indicate that there is a significant cost associated with Russia's behavior, that could start to stabilize the relationship. That could start to institute some deterrence on Russia, because a cyber attack on the US could result in a cyber attack on Russia. Interference in the US wouldn't be exactly symmetrical with how we would behave with Russia, but there are a lot of things we should be doing with regards to supporting civil society in Russia that we're not doing, because we've ceded that diplomatic internal terrain to Russia. And those types of things could help normalize the relationship, but we haven't been there with it yet with a relatively robust, muscular response to Russia just yet.
I think that's fascinating to all of us. I might just, one very brief follow-up on that. Does it worry you that the Russians might begin to cooperate more systematically with the Chinese to America's disadvantage? And is there anything we can do about it?
That is absolutely the case. It's been the trend line for quite a few years. I would say easily since the sanctions that we applied to Russia as a result of their aggression towards Ukraine. But these are driven by mutual interests, national security interests on Russia's side and national security interests on China's side. And I like to describe that relationship as having both a ceiling and a floor. The ceiling in the relationship hasn't changed. I don't think you're going to have, there is no way that Russia is going to wish to be involved in a confrontation as stemming from China, and China is going to be involved in any confrontation stemming from Russia. So there's a firm ceiling that limits, how far that relationship can go, and it'll be well shy of an alliance, and certainly well shy of any mutual defense pact. But the floor has increasingly has continued to rise in that relationship, with a significant amount of cooperation, enormous amount of cooperation on the economic front, certainly to Russia's benefit, less so to, there's energy benefit for China, but in terms of GDP. Military cooperation has been increasing with really a fairly significant level of interoperability developing, same thing in the cyber domain. One of the things that troubles me most actually is in the information domain, that you see a convergence between Russia and China in the way they use disinformation and misinformation and information operations, that China, especially in the COVID, during the COVID pandemic era, has adopted a lot of Russia's tradecraft with regards to the information space. And I think on that base, so that takes care of the convergence side, that there's a ceiling and a floor. But can the U.S. do something about it? Well, that's one of the things I think I will try to get to in my thesis. Although it's a diplomatic history of U.S. policy towards Ukraine, I do look at the relationships that the U.S. has with borderlands around great powers. And I believe that there are investments that could be made, critical investments that could be made that could actually impact geopolitics and Russia's relationship with China. And I think, frankly, investments in Ukraine can get us there.
Well, we'll all look forward to that as well. I think Professor Hopman, yeah.
Good morning. I'm Terry Hopman, colleague in the Foreign Policy Institute, but until last year, I was a former director of the conflict management program here, and before that of the Global Security Program at the Watson Institute at Brown University, where we worked mostly in the former Soviet Union. I'd like to get to the substance of the Trump-Zelensky talk a little bit, and because, of course, it was about the question of aid to Ukraine, in particular in the form of anti-tank missiles and things like that, but also to put it in the broader context of what you see as the evolution of the conflict. For better or for worse, the line of contact has not changed since February of 2015 in the Minsk agreement. But on the other hand, we're in a complete stalemate that doesn't seem to be enough to drive the parties at this point to get serious about negotiating in the Minsk context. So how do you see, first of all, the U.S. military support for Ukraine? What are its intentions in terms of the longer-term strategic goals? And how do you see this perhaps eventually feeding into maybe increasing the chances of getting some successful negotiation at some point in the future to resolve this issue that is still, of course, a subject of great damage, particularly to the people who live in the regions of Lugansk and Donetsk who are affected by this conflict?
So I guess, Professor Hoffman, I would say that there is one party that's willing to negotiate and compromise and one party that's not. So the Ukrainians would be willing to come up with some negotiated solutions that wouldn't completely undermine their sovereignty and independence, like federalization, where there's a veto from these, let's say, imagined reincorporated regions of Lugansk and Donetsk. So that they couldn't necessarily do that, but there's a lot of willingness to compromise in general. But the Russians don't want that. I think I think under a maximalist scenario where Russia gets everything it wants, there's a way to end the conflict in eastern Ukraine that would still leave Crimea outside of sovereign control by Ukraine. But even then, I think fundamentally what Russia's after is control over Ukraine, a veto over Ukraine's destiny and orientation towards Europe. So unless they had extremely high confidence that they could do that, which federalism may or may not hold, I don't know if that would be even sufficient. There's probably some sort of criteria that could be met where the war's ended. I think what we're looking at is probably years-long, decades-long conflict in which Russia is on the losing side of the equation. In the period of time between when I became responsible for Ukraine at the White House on the National Security Council, the GDP of Ukraine was somewhere about $100 billion. We're talking about 3 years later, it's closer to $160 billion. And as Ukraine becomes prosperous, I mean, it has a lot of things to do in order to get there with regards to reforms, anti-corruption measures that drive foreign direct investment, drive reinvestment, maybe drive prosperity and some of the economic migrants to return back to Ukraine. There's a long way to go, but they're slowly moving in that direction. I took 2 trips to Ukraine, one in August and September, one in September for my research, and I could see kind of fairly significant improvements, just anecdotal, but walking around and pulsing the community as well as pulsing the decision makers that I was talking to during my interviews. I think that Russia is on the losing side of this equation, that Ukraine will continue to gain coherence over a national identity and patriotic national identity that will be tied to Europe and further separated from Russia. Russia probably, again, was its own worst enemy in eastern Ukraine in that they cleaved off between eastern Ukraine and Crimea. They cleaved off the brakes on Ukraine's integration with the West. Those are the areas that would have traditionally voted for policies that were more conservative, more balanced, more pro-Russian, and Russia's cleaved those off. So I think as time wears on, what you'll have is a increasingly prosperous Ukraine that will not just pose significant challenges to the Donbass and Russia's control of the Donbass and the Crimea, but frankly, fundamentally pose challenges to Russia itself. That you have a Slavic cousin half brother, according to, if you listen to Putin's own rhetoric, one people with an artificial border, one side is prospering and the other side's falling behind. And I've been thinking about, what other examples, historical examples there are for this, the pull that Ukraine could have on Russia over the long term. And what comes to mind is West Germany and its impact on East Germany during the Cold War. And you could have a compelling reason where the Russians ask, why not us? We're the same people. Why don't we enjoy the same freedoms? Why are we falling so far behind? And part of the obligation of the US and the EU is to recognize this opportunity, invest in this opportunity, both for Ukraine, but also for the national security of those countries, those regions, and frankly, ease some of our issues with regards to Russia over the long term.
Very, very interesting. Yes, Charles Gotti.
Thank you, and thank you for your book, excellent book, which I have read. I'm Charles Gotti, Russia, Europe, here at SAIS. And my question is a follow-up to the immigrant theme that was raised at the beginning so well. I'm also an immigrant from a dictatorship many years before you came here. And I have, like you, tended to idealize the United States. Given our past, this is totally understandable. Tell me this, if you're willing to. To what extent have your ideals been compromised by, not just by Trump, but the American experience of the last few years with millions and millions of people supporting the corrupt and nonsensical foreign policy of the United States?
It's an excellent question. I'd say I've been searching for a word that could accurately describe, because I wouldn't say shaken. I would say it's definitely caused some reflection on whether here right matters in the United States. But my experience, again, the perspective that probably you and I share in a lot of ways suggests that we are still the greatest experiment in democracy in the world, longest surviving democracy, greatest democracy in the world. Now, that shouldn't in any way detract from the fact that we have major challenges in the United States, whether that's institutional racism that we've not successfully dealt with, probably one of the biggest breaks on US prosperity. And if we could make some significant gains there, that could really, frankly, bring American society together in the long run for the challenges we face in the 21st century. Income inequality, which has probably, we haven't experienced anything quite like this since probably the Gilded Age, that we managed to come up with some solutions in crisis, frankly. Only 100 years into our democracy, we came up with some solutions that haven't kept pace with our economy and our society. Now, probably 100 years later from the last time we really conducted truly robust reforms to address the needs of society, we're falling behind there. We are in a hyper-partisan world where segments of society believe that we had it better a generation before, instead of believing that our future is better than it is today, and which is a kind of a fundamentally divergent view of the idea of creating a more perfect union, which is forward-looking. And those grievances are something that has to be fundamentally addressed. I don't think there is probably some subset of hardcore irreconcilables, ethnocentric nationalists that really don't care about, have a kind of a nihilistic vision of the United States. there's probably some subset, this subset that we won't be able to deal with. But I don't think that's representative of all the 74 million voters that voted for Donald Trump and thought another 4 years of Donald Trump would be fine. I think, that, and what I really, part of the issue, there's, I guess, two things. One, I think this current administration has fallen short on accountability and exposing the dangers of the Trump administration, and believe that, with a new election and a new administration coming in, we're back to business as usual. That's a false premise. I describe it as an open, festering wound, which we can't heal from until we deal with some of these things. So there has to be an accountability that should start all the way, and I understand this is legally challenging, but it should start all the way at the top and work its way through all the officials that fail to live up to their obligations and expose the big lie of stolen elections, expose corruption. And the other thing is, we just need to, the president, the administration, our society needs to embrace some form of, some way to draw the American public into participating in democracy, participating in society. We haven't had that kind of call to arms, I think, since probably John F. Kennedy and his statements. Ask not what your country could do for you, but what you can do for your country. We need that kind of call to action to get the American public to participate. And I try to add my small voice as often as I can to get the public to participate, to recognize that there are some perils that we're facing, and through participation, we might be able to overcome them. And my line of here right matters, I now say, if we want right to matter in the United States, we need to make right matter.
Well, we have a lot of questions from students as well. Maybe one in the back and then one right here.
Hi, I'm Evan Gottesman. I'm a student here at SAIS. Thank you for coming to speak here. I heard you in an interview on NPR back in August, where you spoke a little bit about your interactions with your family when this was all happening, and specifically your father, who started off this more positively inclined toward President Trump and toward the change. I was curious if you could speak a little more to that, and also if it's still possible, or how you can get through to people, given how hyper-partisan things are, like you just spoke about, and given, frankly, that there's millions of people in this country who are basically in a parallel reality. Things happened differently last year, and they actually did, so on and so forth.
Right. I'll start off with the second half. I think part of this is, when I talk about values-based leadership, I couch it as our expectations for our elected officials have fallen enormously. I mean, when we see the next in a series of scandals, we say, well, that's politics. That's the way it is. And we have really a low bar for our office holders. When in fact, if we want our office holders to be, to perform to a higher standard than the rest of society. And when I wrote my article critical of Chairman Milley and his efforts to reputation launder, his deep concerns about Donald Trump in the waning days of the Trump administration, not saying anything at that time, but waiting many months to talk to book authors about his deep concerns. My part of my concern was that, why should the chairman of the Joint Chiefs be held to a lower standard than a lieutenant colonel? Shouldn't we expect our senior leadership to perform at a higher level? So one of the things I really encourage is this idea of keeping officials accountable to the duties of their office, to the highest standards of public service. And when I couch my criticism, it tends to be on those lines, that they've not performed adequately. I'm not sure. I mean, I try to do this with using my own voice on an individual basis. I'm not sure if there's a good institutional effort that I've seen in this regard. I participate in the Renewed Democracy Initiative because we're trying to create some thinking on how to have a much more effective, ethical political class. I think there are a number of reforms that obviously would help with this. Everything from campaign finance reforms and public support to election campaigns, to open primaries. There's all sorts of things that we need to do. To a certain extent, it's a question about where do we start? A plan, like what steps can we take to heal our society? I haven't seen anything like that, and I would hope that our executive branch would be able to articulate a vision of this sort, or at least kind of launch an effort in partnerships with civil society to do that. And I'm struggling for kind of a logical way to approach this. With regards to my father, to me, there were a couple of different factors. First of all, he's a refugee from a communist authoritarian regime. There is a feature amongst refugees from that kind of background where they tend to turn very conservative, probably unhealthy in an unhealthy manner. You see this playing out with the Russian, Soviet refugee community, Vietnamese community, Venezuelan and Colombian community in the U.S. They tend to reject anything that smacks of left and liberalism, or not liberal, communism or socialism, and in a probably in a visceral way, not a kind of a thoughtful way about what these terms really mean. So that's the environment that my father kind of has lived in the United States. And he came here at the age of 47, witnessing the corruption of communism. His support for Donald Trump stemmed from there, and from the fact that he thought this would be. He believed in the line of President Trump, non-political, could come in and drain the swamp. That rhetoric kind of appealed to him, not having ineffective politicians that don't move the country along. But I never really had to fear for where he would end up. If he supported Donald Trump early on, he did so because he didn't have all the facts and didn't quite understand the level of President Trump's corruption and the way he, why I reported what I did. And when the facts became apparent, he supported me. He didn't support Donald Trump. And I never had to worry about the fact that, I would have my dad's love and support. It's not one of those broken family stories. And there's another factor here, but it escapes me. So I think that we'll just leave it there. Thanks.
We have another question right here, please.
Hi, my name is Jensen Hu. I'm a student here at SAIS. Thank you so much for being here today. So when I was a volunteer in Kharkiv, Eastern Ukraine, 2 years ago, I got the experience to travel across Ukraine and talk to a lot of people. My understanding is that the Chinese are doing a lot of investments, critical investments, tech investments in Ukraine. In many parts of Ukraine, I saw commercials of Huawei, Meizu, these major tech companies. And then recently, a Chinese company also signed a contract with Ukrainian counterparts to renovate Ukrainian metro system. And so do you think American tech companies can play a larger role instead of policymakers, instead for a larger, broader part of foreign policy? Perhaps we can do some kind of organic experiment in terms of American tech companies like Google and others playing a larger role in Ukraine and taking this opportunity to steer Ukraine towards the West, instead of having Ukraine steer towards China, because Chinese are saying, hey, we can provide better service, cheaper materials, but also help you renovate your country and help you reform. And so do you want to do you see we can take the opportunity? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think it's important to understand that U.S. companies make financial calculations on their investments in Ukraine, and a lot of those calculations are based on risk, based on the fact that there's a justified perception of corruption that there are insufficient reforms to protect private property, whereas Chinese companies are extensions in a lot of ways. I don't want to overstate this, but they also serve a state goal. And therefore, it doesn't have to be a purely economic calculation for investment. There could be an influence calculation. There could be a control calculation for those types of investments. So it's really not the same kind of playing field. It seems to me that there are supports that could be offered from a national security perspective, whether it's the Development Finance Corporation to secure U.S. investments in the region because there's strategic value, and other kinds of reforms that have been instituted to add a national security component to the way our economy operates that could help drive some investments in this direction in key relationships. I think these are relatively new reforms, things that have been instituted relatively recently within the past couple of years, and the system hasn't quite caught up. The other key bit of baggage with regards to Ukraine is that it's in certain ways kind of radioactive as a legacy of the Trump scandal, of the Trump-Ukraine scandal. And companies will make judgments based on their perception of political risk as to whether they invest in Ukraine. So unless this administration really articulates kind of a strategic vision and a commitment to Ukraine, and then offers the operational support that I talked about with regards to, investment insurance or financing through the Development Finance Corporation, it's going to be hard to do that. But it's essential. So to me, a part of this, the story here is articulating a vision for Ukraine from a national security perspective, as well as an economic perspective, to start to drive some of this investment and supplant the investment that comes in from China that, again, is not purely economic, or at least not totally economic. There are national security implications in China's investment in Russia, as there are pretty much anywhere else.
Yes, another question. Right.
Thank you, Alex. Heritage Yakabana, also a fellow DIA student, third cohort, also an immigrant. And like you, I was drawn to service at a very young age in the United States, so I've been an active duty officer for a while. And I'm trying to understand the dynamics that exist between Russia and the US, particularly what does Russia want? What is its end game? If you can kind of solve that puzzle for us, that would be great to hear from your perspective.
Yeah. So there are different labels for Russia's actions. I think I prefer irredentist, at least in part, meaning they don't necessarily want to reestablish the entirety of the Soviet Union or in the borders that existed prior to 1991. But there are some key critical pieces of terrain, and those are Belarus and Ukraine, that are absolutely essential to Russia's viability in a multipolar world. If Russia wants to be a pole in a multipolar world, it needs Ukraine, because Ukraine enables economic power, it enables military power, provides a population base. It needs Ukraine to be in the Eurasian Economic Union, a member of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, member. It doesn't necessarily, these are not, the maximalist view is that they're incorporated, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like that either. It just needs Ukraine to clearly be in its sphere. The West is not prepared to give up on this idea of self-determination, of the sovereignty of states that spun off and achieved independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that is a fundamental reason why we will just can't see eye to eye on the fundamental issues between the fundamental challenges between the U.S. and Russia. I think there's also potentially an ideological explanation in that the Western liberal order, even though during the Cold War, the communist bloc was in opposition to the Western liberal order, the Soviet Union still participated in some facets of the Western liberal order, whether that was the United Nations, eventually being drawn into different kind of institutions. And those institutions never served, neither in the Soviet period, post-war period, or in Russia, the history of the Russian Federation have never really served Russia's interests. So in that regard, Russia is looking for alternatives. And this is one of the things that as I look at China, is a little bit less clear, because China has benefited immensely from the world order and participation in the world order with economic growth, participation in capitalism and market systems. And therefore, to me, it's a little bit less clear what China's perspectives are. I think it's in the comparison and the contrast between the two that, to me, help define Russia as a player that's clearly looking for alternatives, and probably the biggest challenge to what the U.S. sought to establish after World War II with Western liberal institutions. And I think an approach that seeks to entice Russia back into the fold seems unlikely. There's a significant element of realpolitik. Can you entice Russia with participation in Western liberal order? My view is definitively not. And I think there's where my consideration goes is there needs to be both a relatively firm policy with regards to Russia seeking to upend the international order, upend U.S. leadership, play a spoiler with regards to U.S. policies. There needs to be a cost associated with that, and that at minimum, that's the part of the formula that's missing. You need both a kind of a coercive as well as a carrot and stick approach, and we don't have. We've only attempted to thus far entice Russia with carrots for a long portion of the post Cold War period, and not enough stick and not enough cost. So I think we're in for easily another decade of significant challenges from Russia. Russia is likely to, in my view, to be the most significant challenge in the next 3 to 5 years for the U.S. rather than China. I think I could justify that through an assessment of Russia's capabilities and intent. Russia has potent defense and security capabilities, informational capabilities, but it's also had demonstrated an intent. This is empirical, an intent to attack the U.S. and attack the Euro-Atlantic alliance, to attack the Western liberal order. China has been different. It definitely has potent capabilities, but its intent is a little bit less clear. Its intent is starting to clarify a little bit, but I wonder how much of that is due to the fact that there's zero cost for Russia in its attack on the Western liberal order, and the conclusion for China is that it could be more aggressive, more assertive in advancing interests instead of playing within the rules. And I think that, again, until we start to impose a cost on bad actors in the international system, and that's not just the U.S. by itself, it's our alliances. It's why we need a democracy summit that we're encouraging, in a way, or tacitly approving authoritarian actors from challenging the international system.
We're getting close to the end, but I see we do have another, maybe the last question.
This question is from a former SAIS student. Do you have a view on the former president's ability to withhold information from Congress based on executive privilege?
I think we lost it.
one seems okay.
I do. I think that more importantly, President Biden has a view on it. And President Biden's view is that he's waiving the assertions of executive privilege by President Trump and his attorneys, which is critical. I think there's always a desire by the chief executive to preserve freedom of maneuver and defend executive privileges regardless of the administration. And it looks like the calculation from the Biden administration is quite simple, is that this waiving executive privilege for President Trump will allow for a more thorough investigation under the January 6th Commission or any other Department of Justice efforts to expose Trump administration corruption, and hopefully, this is the approach that they're taking with regards to accountability. So I completely agree with this idea that that President Trump can't just assert executive privilege, especially that he's the former president, to protect himself, use that as a shield to avoid justice.
I don't see any further questions. I do think that certainly this has been self-provoking, many of them, no doubt. We will have further thoughts, further questions. This has really been an exciting discussion. Thank you very much, Alexander, for this experience, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue and delighted to have you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, everybody.